thank you very much for being here. I'm very grateful for being here today. So let's begin, please, with Laura Vázquez.
Thank you for this introduction, very interesting introduction, Enrique. I would like to thank my colleague Camelia Tigao from UNAM for this invite to participate in this webinar on skilled migration and COVID. It is a pleasure to collaborate in this forum and share with you some ideas. In this brief I thought it was 7 to 10 minutes, but I'll keep it down to 7-minute intervention on my part. I would like to share thoughts on 2 issues related to skilled migration and COVID. Firstly, I'd like to speak about the management of the COVID crisis by Australia, a country in which skilled migration has played an important role since the last decades of the 20th century. And secondly, the case of international students, their weight on Australian universities and the COVID impact on this sector. So on the first point, before entering on the Australian responses to managing the COVID crisis, which I will keep for the policy discussion part, I would like to firstly and very briefly make a quick introduction to the topic of skilled migration in Australia and its importance, particularly since the 1980s. The number of permanent skilled migrants arriving yearly in Australia has increased dramatically, from 10,000 in the mid-1980s to 120,000 yearly in the past 5 years. During 2018 in Australia, there was an arrival of 112,000 skilled migrants. A high proportion of Latin American migrants from countries such as Mexico have migrated on this stream. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, among the foreign-born migrants currently residing in Australia, around 136,000 come from Latin American countries. And of these, nearly 5,000 were born in Mexico. The vast majority of Mexican migrants are highly skilled in Australia. As you all know, you probably know, not the majority of Mexican migrants are highly skilled. 65% of Mexican-born migrants have a bachelor degree level of education or above in Australia, as compared to 20% of those born in Australia and 32% born overseas. So with regards to the Mexican population in Australia, we're talking about one of the most highly skilled cohorts in the country. Australia and the rest of the world, as we all know, have entered curious times facing the threat of COVID-19. In recent weeks, many countries around the world, including Australia, have imposed travel restrictions to help curb the spread of the coronavirus. Airport closures, restrictions, suspension of all incoming and outgoing flights, nationwide lockdowns, enforced quarantine, and are just some of the measures countries are adopting in an effort to contain the pandemic. So in today's world, where we have 272 million international migrants, many will have difficulties returning to their home countries in the near future due to the increasing travel restrictions and fewer commercial airline flights. And obviously, this affects both skilled and less skilled migrants. The Australian government has imposed a travel ban on non-permanent residents and non-citizens entering Australia. This means that if someone holds a temporary visa, he or she cannot travel to Australia. That means the ban includes people who are outside Australia and hold a student visa, graduate visas, provisional skilled visas, and other temporary visas. I will delve into the case of student visa holders in the second point. Individuals who are in Australia and hold a temporary visa, the ban does not affect them, nor does it prevent them from departing from Australia. It does not affect them in the sense that they do not have to leave the country. Now, in terms of the financial support provided by the Australian government, and this is an important point in terms of policy, in addition to the strong control and sanitation measures implemented by the Australian government to deal with the COVID pandemic, Australia has been characterized by the great financial support provided to its citizens and permanent residents, many of these being highly skilled migrants. An Australian colleague of mine wrote to me back in April and said, huge amount of money have been allocated to support people thrown out of work. Australia has been able to provide enormous tax support to both individuals and businesses experiencing economic difficulties. The Australian government economic response has been focused primarily on supporting companies in managing short-term cash flows, ensuring that employers can keep their employees during this difficult period. And there's several measures. I won't get into the details of them, but these cash flows supporting Australian companies have helped for companies to keep their employees, which are both on all kinds of visas and migration statuses. Initially, the government announced many of these measures would last for 6 months, but in the last month, they announced that they will keep them until March 2021. So they are already expecting these, as all around the world, that this will continue. The problems with the COVID and the economic consequences will continue for a long time. So just to sum up with regards to this first point, I'd like to highlight that Australia, an important destination for high-skilled migration, is one of the countries around the world with some of the highest COVID mobility restrictions. Many of these high-skilled migrants are citizens and permanent residents, but they are citizens or permanent residents, but a significant number are on high-skilled temporary visas in vulnerable situations and in many cases not eligible for financial support. Skilled migrants in Australia, although not restricted to leave Australia, are virtually stranded indefinitely in the country, given their countries of origins, poor management of the pandemic, and they're left struggling with the significant impacts on their capacity to respond to their family and other transnational commitments by not being able to go back to their countries. Now, the other issue I would like to touch upon is the case of international students and their relative importance on Australian universities during and post-COVID. One of the types of skilled migration hardly hit by the COVID crisis is the case of international students. As countries imposed ban on travel, thousands of students have become stranded and have seen their academic plans interrupted without a foreseeable solution. The 4 main English language competitors of international students, namely the USA, UK, Canada, and Australia, have all imposed travel restrictions, and many universities have implemented changes to teaching, including a shift from face-to-face learning to online education. This has had a significant impact on international students. Australian universities are suffering revenue and job losses due to the current and projected loss of international students. It is estimated that the sector may lose up to 19 billion Australian dollars in the next 3 years, and more than 20,000 jobs are at risk over the next 6 months. So it is not an exaggeration to assert that without international students, Australian universities will downsize and some might collapse altogether. From 2003 to 2018, international onshore student revenue rose on average as a share of all universities' revenue from 14% to 26%. So for some universities, the dependency is even greater, well exceeding 30%. In July, just last month, the Australian government announced visa changes to ensure international students are not worse off due to the coronavirus pandemic, and that Australia remains competitive with other countries. This is a very important issue for the government to remain competitive, as international students are such an important income, a part of the Australian economy. I'll keep, if you're interested, for the discussion part, some of those changes that the Australian government announced for the case of international students. So just basically to highlight some of the points I just raised in terms of international students, they're one type of high-skilled migrants strongly affected by the COVID crisis. Their situation is particularly vulnerable as they are not eligible to the government's financial support schemes. And in many cases, them and their families have had they have made enormous investments into their international academic experience. Students who commenced their studies prior to COVID have to make the hard decision to either stay in the destination country, in this case, Australia, with no face-to-face learning, maintaining the burden of all the costs of being in the foreign country in isolation, or returning to their country with an indefinitely interrupted academic plan for their tertiary education. For those students who were to commence their studies right at the inception of the pandemic and afterwards, have had to put on hold their plans for international study. So I'll leave it to that, and I'm looking forward to hearing the thoughts of my colleagues and participating in the discussion part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for this very informative account